Greetings from NAFSA 2018. This is NAFSA Worldview with Brandon Hamber. I'm Simon Adams, Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. Professor Brandon Hamber is the John Hume and Thomas P. O'Neill Chair in Peace at Ulster University, based at the International Conflict Research Institute, or INCOR. He is also a member of the Transitional Justice Institute at the university and is visiting professor of the African Center for Migration and Society at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He has undertaken consulting and research work and participated in various peace and reconciliation initiatives in Northern Ireland, South Africa, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, Bosnia, Colombia, the Basque Country, and Liberia, among others. It's a pleasure to speak to you this afternoon.
You too.
First question. At our annual conference, you're a keynote speaker at the Seminar on Peace and Global Civil Society. The seminar's theme this year is Evolving Roles and Responsibilities of International Higher Education in Peacebuilding. And the higher education community often finds itself, during conflict situations, as either a target or as a site for political mobilization. What roles should faculty, staff, administrators play in alleviating conflict and building peace?
Well, obviously, different contexts are going to be really different. And for some universities, the challenge of conflict is going to be immense. If you look at Iraq in terms of having to literally rebuild institutions that were flattened to the ground is going to be quite different to other contexts, such as Northern Ireland, where the institutions remain, but actually the conflict also impinges on the university. There were people killed on the campus during the conflict, for example, on the campus that I work on. So each context is going to be quite different. So each of the solutions to how one might deal with that is obviously going to be quite different. But most importantly, I would say universities probably have to make a decision as to whether are they actually going to try and intervene in the conflict. Are they going to try and make a difference, or are they going to retreat to traditional ideas of universities? I would say in most conflict situations, you don't really have that luxury. I gave the example of conflict coming to the campus. The conflicts come to the campuses. So you have to do something. So the first thing for me is make a decision that you are going to try and be part of the society, be part of the community, try and influence that, either through your policy, either through changing your student body, or the type of research, the type of policy work that you might be supporting. So there are a number of different things and decisions you can make.
Right. And the two campuses you mentioned, University of Ulster, of course, the conflict comes on to the campus, and also the University of Witwatersrand, where I also studied, by the way.
All right.
There's no escaping the conflict which impinges on the campus as well. So what kind of tools do you then give students as an educator to try and turn them into peace builders?
Yeah, I think that's difficult, because obviously there are specialized courses that might be doing that. I teach peace and conflict studies, so we would be focusing very specifically on the types of skills which might be analytical or might be skills about how to engage in dialogue. So there might be specialist courses that are focusing on that. It's more difficult for perhaps students who that isn't really what they've come to study. They've come to study computer science or whatever the case might be. And I think in those cases, it's difficult to know what you bring directly into the classroom, but it's important that the university is creating spaces where people can talk and engage with issues, that we are not really selling ourselves as somehow neutral, because I don't think you can really be neutral, but that you can offer critical, open spaces where people can share their views, where they can talk about what they think is problematic, and that we use the skills we have to keep that facilitated in a way that doesn't make it turn into a sort of downward spiral of aggression and anxiety, which is not easy in certain contexts.
And can be very dangerous for the academics involved as well. In the case of Witwatersrand, of course, David Webster was targeted, an academic who was targeted and killed by the apartheid state for his activities.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it is interesting you studied the same university as me, and as you probably recall, the police were on the campus when I was a student all the time. It was such a intense environment, and it can certainly be really dangerous. Universities can provide some shelter in relation to that, and if the leadership is in discussions with the various powers that be, they can, I think, mediate some of that. But I think in those highly volatile contexts, it's difficult to say this is what you can specifically do to stop people who are intent on coming after someone is is pretty difficult for a university to manage. I mean, I wouldn't want to be naive about that.
Yeah. My own experience, I was in South Africa during the transition to democracy and at Witwatersrand. And my family actually come from Northern Ireland. So this is something I've thought about a lot as well. How much can you take lessons from one experience and translate it over to another experience? You sort of touched on this earlier, but it's not the case that every experience is bespoke, but it's also not the case that you can just apply a one-size-fits-all kind of fixing everything that happens in a different conflict. So how do you see common themes that are useful across different conflicts?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and our lives are probably overlapping in some sort of way. I was also there during the transition, and then I moved to Northern Ireland in 2001. So probably I do look at conflict, I mean, from those two vantage points particularly, but I've worked in other places as well. I mean, the short answer is obviously every society is different. Every context is different. But when I think about it, I think the two things which are not necessarily the same, but are always present are people and politics. So people, firstly, people are going to experience the conflict in different ways, and they're going to react to that, whether that's with fear, whether that's with resilience, whether that's with resistance, whether that's with silence. You know, in Northern Ireland, I don't know if your family or others, you've heard people say, whatever you say nothing.
Whatever you say nothing.
You know, so the people will react to the conflict, whether it's about talking at a fancy dinner party or at the bus stop, whatever it might be. People are having to manage it and deal with it. And in that context, you would see many things that are similar. You know, people's fears of the future, fears for their children, unsure should they get involved, should they put their head above the parapet. Those type of reactions are pretty similar in most contexts. So you're always dealing with that, which I think cuts across. And then in most contexts, well, in all contexts, you're dealing with politics and you're dealing with politicians. But the things which I've seen that have always made a difference have been when you have people who are willing to offer leadership. And what I mean by that, I probably mean a sort of positive leadership, where even perhaps they're sacrificing some of their own political party or political aspirations to do in a certain context what might be the right thing. So political risk-taking as something which makes a difference is something which you would see in a lot of contexts, whether you're talking about President Santos in Colombia. I know the situation there is sliding back a bit, but you know, that's risk-taking. If you think of Mandela's shifts that he made, or Martin McGuinness or Ian Paisley in Northern Ireland, these people have all stepped out of a sort of fairly entrenched position to try and move things into a different way. Or John Hume in Northern Ireland is of course another very strong, powerful example in relation to that.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question about transitional justice, which is something I'm very interested in as well? What I do now, I run a human rights organization that works with the UN Security Council and with the Human Rights Council. So in a lot of the conflicts that we look at in the world, the issue of transitional justice is a big issue. And I think in many of these conflict situations, it's often presented as a choice between peace and justice, or peace versus justice. And I guess in some ways the whole notion of transitional justice is a sort of challenge to that. It says that you can have both. Your own views on that?
Yeah, so for me, I mean, my original training was in psychology as a clinical psychologist, and so I suppose that often influences my own thinking. And so for me, conflict is always an ambivalent space to be in. You have to always hold really contradictory things at the same time. I really don't like this person, I don't like their opinion, but I'm going to have to live with them. And I have to manage those two things simultaneously. Now, why am I saying that? Because for me, how societies deal with their past, where there have been massive human rights violations, which we could think about that in the sort of transitional justice frame, is a process of actually holding and managing quite contradictory things at the same time. So for me, when I think of is it peace or is it justice, I sort of think, well, actually, it's more about how you manage the struggles towards peace and justice over a long period of time in tension with each other. So it's not like you're either doing one or you're doing
it's
other.
Not a binary choice.
Yeah, it's actually it's a sort of tension that you're managing, and it's the unfortunate reality of getting older is you have the experience, just as we talked about being in South Africa at the time of the transition, that you suddenly realize, well, like 20 years or more has like gone by, and countries have been managing these processes over a long period of time. So when we were in the middle of the Truth Commission in South Africa, it felt like that was everything. It was all going to be sorted out within 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
Actually, now we know racial tension in South Africa is really high. Inequality still hasn't been addressed. So how we define justice in that context might have been different to thinking about justice for direct human rights violations at the moment. So for me, peace and justice then becomes a much longer, non-binary, as you said, idea over a longer period of time, and we get ourselves into really serious trouble when we start to say, and it would be one of my challenges for transitional justice, do we have this toolkit which can address this issue now and today as if it's going to end? I mean, if you've thousands of people killed in human rights violations, you're not going to deliver justice in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, even 15 or 20 years.
Yeah. Related to that is the issue of truth. So, we live in a world at the moment where there's a lot of discussion about the issue of truth, fake news, alternative facts, and so forth. But in the two conflicts that you've worked the most on, and which we've talked so much on, partly because of, I think, our somewhat shared history, the issue of truth played a huge role. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which was a very important part of the arc in the transition. And truth has played a very important role in the north of Ireland as well. The truth about things that happened in the past on all sides and coming to terms with that. So how important do you see the issue of truth and dealing with the past in terms of peace building and creating a new future?
So maybe this sounds a bit like a sort of fluffy peace builder type of answer, but I mean, I think truth is also a process. I mean, of course, there's specific forensic truth. I mean, if you go to a court and someone is found guilty of something or not guilty of something, that is a forensic, factual truth. An event happened or an event didn't happen.
Right.
But in societies that have gone through massive upheaval and massive human rights violations, the truth is actually a process because people have different subjective ideas of what that truth was about. So although the court might say so-and-so killed A or B, the populace might still be unsure about how they interpret that. Was that legitimate, or legitimate with a small l, or really legitimate? And those are the unfortunate realities of people who've been in conflict. That is how people think. You would turn on the news and you'd hear about something terrible happening and think, well, that person was causing trouble, so this, we understand why that has happened, whatever the interpretation is. So you might have this forensic bit, but there's a sort of subjective bit. I suppose in the language, people would often talk about the idea of sort of multiple narratives and different narratives that exist of the past. And how you address those different narratives, those competing narratives, those subjective narratives, is an unfolding process. And forensic forms of truth can help with that. So when a court case happens or the Bloody Sunday inquiry in Northern Ireland happens, it puts a stake in the ground and says this definitely happened, and so it sort of changes the course of the narrative discussion. So you need the quest for forensic truth, but you also need these social processes which allow people to start to talk about their interpretations and not be afraid to talk about their interpretations. And also and this is the hardest thing, is to find a way that your interpretation might actually change. So if I think of Northern Ireland, my concern there very often is that actually it's moved very far forward, as you know, but that people will still say, well, I have my truth and you have your truth, and we can accept that now, and I can respect yours and you can respect mine, and that's great. That's better than like me fighting with you about the truth. Of course, that's an advancement. But if that's as far as we're going to go, that I can't even see my truth interacting with yours, and it's somehow changing and shifting, then I think there's not much. Well, there's hope for the future, but I mean it limits the hope for the future in some way.
Yeah, I moved back to South Africa, and that was something that really struck me when I moved back in 2007. I lived there from 2007 to 2010. I couldn't believe how much things had changed in ways that I couldn't imagine when I lived there during the 1990s. I'm not South African, but I lived there during the 1990s, during the transition. And yet in Northern Ireland, I still feel that people are living in histories that are very sealed off from one another, and that there hasn't been that kind of progress in the construction of a new narrative, which is a shared narrative.
Yeah, I mean, there's very little space for a shared narrative in Northern Ireland. I mean, some of that's about the nature of the conflict.
Right.
So South Africa, for want of a better way of putting it, was a nationalist struggle on both sides.
Yeah.
You just had the white apartheid state who believed certain people belonged in the nation and other people
Yeah.
didn't, and then the liberation movements had a much wider idea of nationalism. So if you could get a joint nationalism, people could buy into it, and so there's a space in that idea for some shared narratives. Now we know people still compete over that, and is the Rainbow Nation a pipe dream or something real? Northern Ireland, you have broadly speaking, two different groups of people who want to be part of different nations. So the idea of finding the joint narrative is a lot more difficult. But you are still looking for some joint understandings of the past. It might be really difficult to find a joint narrative of what this future is going to look like because you have different political aspirations. But you can think about the past in some ways that are joint, that certain events happened that should never have happened. Certain events were criminal. Other events are more difficult to talk about, or whatever the case might be.
What about the issue of forgiveness in all of this? Because that was a big issue in South Africa, of course, and that people tended to conflate the idea of reconciliation with forgiveness, which was never the actual, it might have been Desmond Tutu's intention, but was not the intention of the way the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up. In post-conflict situations, is reconciliation and forgiveness two separate things? Do we move from one to the other? Are they stages? Or
I mean, for me, I don't talk too much about forgiveness. I tend to talk more about reconciliation. And I try to distill reconciliation down to its most basic. And its most basic reconciliation for me is about relationships. And that in a political conflict, it's reconciliation is a great word because sometimes it implies you have to rebuild relationships, but often they weren't there in the first place. Right. So it's about creating and dealing with and rebuilding relationships between people. And everything in societies in conflict has a relational element, whether that's groups which were in conflict with each other or whether in Northern Ireland politicians want to build a road. Right. Why are they benefiting and they're not benefiting? So it's not just a technical task, it's actually a relational task. And so for me, reconciliation is about managing and dealing with those relationships. And similar to what I said a little bit earlier, that's not a complete and easy process. It's actually a paradoxical process very often. So if we think of South Africa, you're saying, broadly speaking, the white and black communities have to mend relationships with each other. But to make that work, we probably have to change the balance of economic well-being. So you're telling somebody, I'm going to take something away from you, but I want you to build a relationship with them at the same time. Or in Northern Ireland, we need to have a new society. We need to be moving forward in a peace process, but we're going to let prisoners out of jail at the same time. So you have to live with something for some people. Obviously for others, they didn't feel that, but some felt there was an injustice. And so I have to live with you, but live with that injustice. So reconciliation for me is the sort of managing this complex processes of relationships. You can't really force it, but you can think about it and you can engage in trying to do that. Forgiveness is slightly different because for me, forgiveness is letting go of all sense of animosity. So I don't even know how to interpret that, but it's a much higher, It's a much higher order thing that you can sort of let go of a complete sense of animosity. And that's quite different. And I don't think that is essential for a society which has been in conflict to function. I think it is essential that you address relationships and you manage them in constructive ways. Sometimes you just live and coexist with them. Sometimes you have to fundamentally transform the nature of them. But I don't think you have to just completely say, I've let go all sense of animosity with you. Now, different people, many who I've spoken to, who would say they have forgiven, have different interpretations of that as well. That's my interpretation. So I've heard people say, look, I've forgiven somebody, but I still harbor a certain feeling towards them. So it's not, so that's a different interpretation. But my interpretation is you let go of all sense of animosity. So I don't really see them as I don't see them as stages. I don't see them as I don't see reconciliation and forgiveness as like one leads to the other. For me, they're almost different processes, and they might serve different and important functions. I mean, people who can really demonstrate forgiveness are really important to societies in conflict, to show people what's actually possible. But I wouldn't say it's absolutely essential.
Yeah.
I'd say it's really good if you can get it, but I
But
wouldn't.
not a prerequisite.
I wouldn't go chasing it.
Yeah. Final question. A question I get asked a lot because I work in conflict zones in different parts of the world from time to time, and the work that I do looking at mass atrocities in the world and working with the Security Council. When you have experience of all these different conflicts and you've worked in all these different conflict situations, what makes you see human beings at their absolute worst, but what makes you optimistic?
I mean, you see human beings at their absolute worst, but you see them at their absolute best. Like you can't work in really difficult situations without being absolutely amazed at how I don't want to say people are always resilient, because sometimes when you say resilient, it's like, well, if you're resilient, it means you can like keep doing stuff to people. But there's sort of a resilience within humans as a species that is quite phenomenal. And so every time you see the terrible things, you're meeting people who are changing things, or changing the world, whether it's in their like families, whether it's in their institutions, whether it's in their society, whether it's in their own head. People have an incredible capability to change things. So it is quite a depressing place to be on some levels, but in that depression, there's always a sort of there's like always some form of hope. In the Truth Commission, one of the things they found was that the people who took the statements from people face to face had less secondary traumatization than the people who were putting the stuff into computers. So the people who were just sitting there typing in statements, like horrendous statements of violation and torture, found that much more difficult than the people who took the statements, because the people who took the statements were meeting the person.
Right.
So although that might sound more difficult because the person is maybe terribly upset and crying in front of you, but then when they leave, you see they've got a family.
Right.
And they've got support. Or maybe actually what's not recorded is, in the midst of their despair, they make a small joke, and in the small joke you realize, this person is managing multiple feelings at the same time. And so I think that, that's a good example of how I think if you're meeting people, if you're meeting real people, to me it's an inspirational thing. It's not like it doesn't push me backwards.
Yeah. No, I can totally relate to that. And for me, it's always upstanders. It's always the people who stand up and go against the grain that are also a real source of inspiration. You do find that wherever you go as well. Yeah.
And people have like more courage than, I wouldn't speak for them, but for myself,
you can include me in that
more
as
courage than me, more forgiveness than me, more generosity than me, more willingness to share when they've got nothing. That's
absolutely.
That's just powerful stuff.
Final question. NAFSA 2018 is a global conference, obviously, of international educators from over 100 countries from all around the world. These are people who work in universities mainly with young people and so forth. So what would be the one message that you want to get over to them about peace building and conflict in the world today?
It's a difficult question. I gave a keynote address and spoke for way too long about all the different things, but this just comes into my head now, but I mean, maybe the one thing I would say, working in a university where I see increasingly this idea of internationalization being about commodification, that students are commodities, students are money that come into your institution. And maybe what I'd want to get across is they're not a commodity, they're a resource. So these are the next leaders of the future. If you have a big international cohort, you're going to have in your classroom people from conflict zones all over the world, and they probably know more than us and more than me in a whole lot of different ways. And so there's this resource that's sitting in your institution that could be harnessed in so many different ways. It could be harnessed for peace building. And we know that through history. Students have done all sorts of things. But, you ask me for one message, I'd sort of say, let's stop thinking about our students as commodities and let's think about them as resources and agents of change. And how can we do that, whether it's in the way we teach or whether it's in the spaces we give the students, or simply if we have a problem, go and ask them. You know, we tend to ask the people upwards rather than metaphorically downwards, but there's a big pool of resources sitting in our institutions.
Well, thank you for your time today, and have a good NAFSA.
Thank you very much.